Hello, everyone, and welcome to this IANA webinar, part of the Intermodal Adapts series. It's great to have you back. If you're a return visitor, if it's your first time, we appreciate you spending some time with us. We are excited to have another presentation of Intermodal Analyzed, our periodic dive into what's happening in intermodal. I think suffice to say, a whole heck of a lot, and we're not going to be able to cover it all in an hour, but we are going to do our best. Thank you to the Platinum Plus sponsors who help us out year long, but in this particular case are helping us bring you this webinar. So we really appreciate their support, and a special thanks to them. Without further ado, today's presentation is brought to us from our friend, the intermodalist, Larry Gross, president and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting. We've worked with Larry for a number of years and in a lot of different capacities, but I know him as a friend and my own personal analyst who digs into the numbers, so I don't have to.
Thanks, Hal, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, as the case might be, depending on where you're located. Great to be with you again to have another session of Intermodal Analyze, and thanks to Hal and the IANA team for allowing me to chat with you folks as I enjoy doing here every couple of months. So, lots to talk about. We're going to try and work our way through some of the high spots here and hopefully still allow a little bit of time at the end for questions. Just for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I am an independent analyst that covers the intermodal space with my one-man company, Gross Transportation Consulting. And our main product, besides IANA webinars, is Intermodal In-Depth, which is a monthly analytical report that's available by subscription. And it goes into all of the kind of issues that we're talking about here today in quite a bit of detail. And if you are interested, we'd love to have joining our subscriber family, and you can find out more information at intermodalindepth.com. So with that shameless self-promotional plug, let's jump in. And the format's going to be pretty much the same as we always use. I'll try and give you a sort of skip around the industry, talk about the major items, I'll give you some charts, and then hopefully leave some time for questions. So here is the latest data from IANA, from the ETSO database, equipment type, size, and ownership, which we use to divide the intermodal business into the two major sectors: international, or as it's also known, IPI, which is the movement of ISO international containers intact on rail, and then domestic is 53-foot domestic containers and what's left of a trailer on flat car, or TUFC. On the left-hand side, you see the monthly volumes of revenue moves as reported by the railroads to IANA for North America. Blue is the IPI, or international numbers, and green is the domestic numbers. Those both work off of the right-hand axis. And then the red is the total intermodal numbers, all in, which are working off the left-hand axis. And so the message here is that if you look at these lines, since about the middle of the year, they are sloping downward. And in the face of tremendous demand. It's not that there aren't folks that are eager to use intermodal services, it's that the industry has not been able to continue to perform at the rate at which it was performing earlier in the year in terms of its productivity. And to put some numbers to it, if you look at that blue line, the IPI, or international line, it peaked back in May. That was the biggest month, and then has the decline fairly consistently since then. And that decline to September, that monthly decline is 13%. So the industry has produced 13% fewer revenue moves in September than it did in May. At the same time that ships are lining up outside the ports of LA and Long Beach and most of the others, in fact, in North America, trying to unload and get their cargo moved. On the domestic side, the domestic peak was back in March, and the decline hasn't been quite as severe because you do see that there was a little bit of a recovery in the July-August timeframe. So the total decline there is 8%. But still, I think there's no question that the demand is out there to make this current performance much higher if the industry was capable of performing at a higher level. What's missing out of this chart on the left is the run-up that you would typically be seeing to peak season. We're not going to have a peak this year. We're going to have a plateau or a mesa, pick your geographic landform, but no peak. And because there's no peak, And we're comparing to last year. If you look on the right-hand side and look at the year-over-year comparison by month, we've moved into some substantially negative territory here in September across the board. And that is only going to get exaggerated in October because I don't think the industry is going to be able to run any faster than it's running now. So we won't see a lot of improvement from September to October, sequential improvement. And that means that we'll be comparing against really a much higher number last year. So I expect to see the year-over-year deficits when the October numbers come in to look a bit worse. Now, one of the things that distorts the numbers when you look at the monthly numbers is that there are differences in the number of working days by month, differences both from month to month. February, for instance, is a short month. August is a very long month, especially this year in terms of the number of working days. And that has to do also with weekend and timing effects and all of that. And then we have the sort of distorting effects of the holiday weekends, like in this case, most recently Labor Day, which lands in the September monthly numbers. So what we try and do is to go through quite a bit of effort to sort of knock all of that noise out of the equation and look at what's happening on an underlying basis with revenue moves per working day. And this is particularly critical right now when the industry is capacity limited. That calculation is presented on the left here. And there are two messages I would draw from this. One is if you look at the domestic situation in terms of revenue moves per working day has stabilized since June. Now, we're not seeing any improvement, but nor are we seeing deterioration. The same cannot be said for the IPI side or the international side of the house, which has been steadily declining since May in terms of the number of IPI revenue moved per working day. And that shows at this point through September, no sign of flattening out. Perhaps it is if we look at the AAR data, I'll do that in a moment, but that's been a very, very long sustained decline. If we go into some detail here on the right-hand side in terms of what September numbers were telling us, and there are three columns here, M/M is month to month, so that's the change from August to September. WW is what year over year, that's the change from this September, last September to this September. And then the working day numbers are the changes in revenue moves per working day from August to September. So a couple of things that you can draw from this. One is that if you look at the year-over-year comparisons, everything is in red, and even at the bottom there, that should be in red, minus 7.3%. We're negative across the board in terms of where we were last year, no matter which equipment type you're looking at. Having said that, there are some areas that are hurting more than others. And one that I'll point out is the short trailer segment, which is almost 20% down versus prior year. So the trailer boom that we saw last year at this time is not being repeated. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is conversion into 53-foot domestic container, and that's happening at a fair clip right now. You've got 53-foot domestic containers being acquired by some traditional pup trailer operators, LTL, parcel, people like FedEx. So that's part of the story. And the other part of the story is I think there's some pretty good evidence here that the e-commerce surge that was taking place last year at this time is not as strong this year. And e-commerce, of course, is a major driver through the parcel carriers for 20-foot pup trailers, as well as the surge fleet that some of the parcel folks operate, which are old 45s and 48s that are brought into the system to deal with the annual holiday surge. And so some of those units aren't running where they were running last year at this time. So overall trailer volume is down substantially. On the domestic container side, we're seeing a much larger year-over-year decrease for the rail-owned fleet, which is about a third of the total North American domestic container fleet versus the privates. But overall, domestic down over 8%. Let's take a look at the right-hand column. That's what's telling us what's happening sequentially here. And when you adjust for the working days between August and September, September had fewer working days than August this year. The situation isn't quite as bad as it looks on the surface. We're actually seeing some slight increases in domestic container throughput in terms of revenue moves per working day. As you can see, all of those numbers in black, domestic container, even short trailer was up a little bit. So there are a few rays of, I won't call it sunshine, but a little bit of light in this equation. The AAR data which comes out weekly, gives us a very close real-time view of at least what's happening top line. It doesn't enable us to segment the data between domestic and international because all what AAR does is capture, is it a container or a trailer? But if I look at the total volumes, you can see by this black line here on the left-hand chart, that's all of North America, Mexico, US, Canada, reporting into the AAR, all of the big railroads. The black line is the weekly intermodal originations across all of these carriers. You can see that it's kind of flattened out after that big decline going from March through, let's say, early summer. It's kind of leveled out on a weekly basis, although still probably trending a little bit down. And here we are in mid-October with absolutely zero sign of any kind of a seasonal peak. And so if you look at the red bars, which are the year-over-year comparison, as I indicated earlier, those are starting to look pretty grim. October will probably see the peak of those year-over-year deficits. But if you look at the left-hand side of that chart, which shows what happened in the fourth quarter, volume stayed strong last year right through mid-December until we hit the holiday season, which is always a drop. You can see it there in the late December, early January timeframe. So I think those year-over-year comparisons are going to continue to be pretty difficult right through the end of the year, unless we start to see some improvement in velocity and in the throughput this year in the system, which I'm not anticipating. The right-hand chart shows you the same data, but just for the United States versus and eliminating Canada, intra-Canadian reporting railroads and Mexican reporting railroads. And the situation looks very much the same. If we look at Canada and Mexico, on the left-hand side, you can see the Canadian situation. And on all of these slides, the light gray line is the 4-week moving average. So that tells you kind of what the general underlying trend is. The black line is the weekly, which tends to be quite a bit more volatile. And Canada has been affected by various push-pull items, including the fires in BC earlier in the summer, which caused that huge drop that you see there. And then, of course, there's always various holiday effects, particularly since this Canadian volume also includes the U.S. railroad operations of the 2 Canadian Class 1s. So there's a fair amount of U.S. componentry in there, as well as Canadians. On the Mexican side, we're being hurt right now because there are political protests that are blocking some of the key intermodal lanes in Mexico. And sadly, that has absolutely nothing to do with the railroads. They're just a way for the teachers to apply pressure to the government. But the railroads are collateral damage there. And you can see that in some of the intermodal numbers that are being posted down there. A big part of what drives intermodal is what's coming in and going out internationally. Probably about 65% of all intermodal activity is, if you count both transloads and IPI, is yoked in some very direct fashion to what's happening with our international trade. And what you're seeing here is the inbound TEUs by month for US and Western Canadian ports on the left in blue, and outbound TEUs in yellow. That data lags by a month, so we have only August data for that. We have the latest September data for the imports. Both of those are operating off of the right-hand axis of that chart, while the red line is the total loaded TEU activity working off of the left-hand axis. And so the message here, the headline is that if you look at that blue line, it has sort of deviated up and down, but remained within kind of a very, relatively narrow band since March. And if we adjusted this for working days, it probably would be even a little bit more flat. The industry is just operating as fast as it can. These ports are operating at max capacity. Doesn't matter how many ships are lining up outside the ports, they're just not able to run any faster. And if you look at the right-hand side, which is the year-over-year comparisons, as we're coming up now to where the run-up of last year flattened out when they started to bump into capacity ceiling, the year-over-year growth, the blue bars in imports is dropping down to almost nothing compared to the astronomical rates of increase that we saw earlier in the year when we were comparing with the pandemic lockdown. If you look at the yellow bars and the yellow line, the news on the export side isn't particularly good. We really have given back some of the ground that we had gained earlier in the year. Whether this is due to a reduction in demand or simply operational dysfunction of the system is a little bit hard to tell, but we've been back in the red, so to speak, below prior year on the export side for the last 2 months, July and August, as this data is constructed. So as a result of this, what we have right now is simply too many ships arriving with too much freight, and they're piling up outside the ports because we really just can't handle any more than we're handling. They are at capacity. Now, one of the trends that's happening is that we're starting to see a little bit of a shift away from LA Long Beach towards the eastern ports, the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. And if you look at this left-hand chart, this chart looks at the share of total North American inbound TEUs that's being accounted for by the US West Coast. And that yellow line is the average share for about 43% that comes into the US West Coast, the balance being Western Canada and Eastern Gulf Coast US. So over the last 4 months, that share has been lower than the average established over the previous 12 months. So a little bit of an indication that things are tending to go a little bit back towards the east. Now, if we look at what's coming out of the Southwest region in particular, and here we're using the IANA ETSO data, there has been a dramatic drop. What we're looking at here are intermodal moves coming out of the Southwest region, which is California, Arizona, and Nevada. And basically, essentially, this is all California. The green line are domestic equipment coming out, and this is 53-foot origination. So this is almost all transload cargo coming out of California. And the blue are the IPI moves coming out of California. And look at the divergence that we have seen here in the last few months, with IPI originations dramatically falling over the last 3-4 months versus the domestic transload volume, which is kind of held steady. The reason this is happening is that the IPI traffic is a lot more mobile, let's say, and can be shifted much more easily from one port to another than the transload traffic, which depends on having the transload infrastructure that really only exists right now in quantity in Southern California. So that volume is very, very sticky, whereas the IPI volume can be diverted to either through the Panama Canal via all water or Suez into the East Coast, or up the coast to Seattle, Tacoma, or Western Canada. You know, that kind of activity is much more mobile and has been fleeing LA Long Beach, as you can see here in the decline that we're seeing of IPI containers coming out of the region. The other thing that this is telling us potentially is that there is, at this point, everybody trying to crowd through the transload keyhole because that's viewed as the most flexible and fastest option remaining to get freight into the heartland in time for the holidays. And the problem always is when everybody tries to get through, then nobody can get through. And that's sort of what we're seeing right now in terms of what's happening in Southern California. So what I did to try and get some color on this was to go to the IANA Intermodal Volume Analyzer, which enables me in a very easy manner to see what's going on with detail directionally between each of these lanes. And I was interested in looking at what's happening with IPI coming off of the West Coast. And here's what I found. Here you see the regions, Northwest, Southwest, Mountain Central, South Central, Southeast, Midwest, Northeast, and then the Canadians, Western Canada, Eastern Canada, and MX is Mexico. And what I've looked at here is volumes coming in and out of the Southwest region. Remember, we're measuring revenue movements here. And I'm looking at it for the 4 long-haul regions that are coming out of the Southwest. So those would be the Midwest, which is Chicago, South Central, which is essentially Texas, Southeast, which would be places like Atlanta, and then the Northeast, which is, of course, New York and everything going out to West Virginia and Virginia. And what we're looking at here is for the three most recent months, what are the eastbound and the westbound flows? Eastbound being the loads coming in to the West Coast, into the ports of LA, Long Beach, and Oakland. And then the western moves are the empties and export loads being returned. And there's something very odd happening here lately. And this analysis was done before we got the announcement yesterday from Union Pacific that they're metering the inbound empty flows coming back into the ICTF big terminal in Southern California, in the LA Long Beach region. Because if you look, normally speaking, July and August, the eastbound, the loaded flows tend to be running a little bit higher than the westbound empty returns. But that situation reversed in September, and that is really unusual. So there are, and because these are all private containers, generally, even if it's an empty, there's revenue associated with the movement of that container to the railroad. Probably not a lot of revenue, but some revenue. And all it takes is a little bit of revenue for it to register in this data. So there were, in September, between the Midwest and the Southwest, more containers going westbound, IPI containers, than eastbound. So call it an overbalance of empties. That wasn't the case with the South Central region. It is the case with the Southeast region, more flowing westbound than eastbound, and certainly the case with the Northeast region, although the numbers there at this point are very, very small. So what you have here is the situation, the system is kind of getting whipsawed by the ocean carriers who are now moving their empties, trying to move their empties back into the port on the West Coast to get them back on the ships and back to Asia for another load. The problem is that there's no room at the ports to accept these empty containers. So they are backing the system up all the way back to the origin ramps in the nation's heartland. This is sort of a dysfunctional behavior. And the metaphor that I would use for it is if you're standing on a diving board at a swimming pool and drop a huge boulder into the pool, there's a wave that goes out from there. And that was that wave of initial cargo, the surge that went out into the system and caused a lot of problems inland. But then if you're on that pool, eventually that wave will hit the other side of the pool and come bouncing back towards you on the diving board. And that's what's happening right now, is that this surge is now echoing and coming back in to a port complex that's not capable of handling it. So I say that one of the reasons why this situation is so bad is because the ocean carriers are trying to optimize their cross-ocean voyage economics, but without much regard for what the effects are inland once they land the containers and start moving those containers around. So if you look at what is happening with regard to inland intermodal movements versus what's coming in off of the ocean, off of the water, the red line here looks at North American IPI TEUs by month versus import TEUs. And so that ratio you can see has really dropped and continues to drop. Whereas if we, on the green chart here on the right-hand side, if we add the transloads back into the equation, then the situation appears to have stabilized in recent months after quite a bit of decline. Now, what's causing this overall decline are really two things. One is the movement away from the West Coast towards the East Coast, where length of haul is shorter. And so that's a less intermodal friendly option. But the other thing that's certainly happening is because of the inability of the intermodal network to flex upward, we're definitely seeing some diversion to truck to the extent that that is possible within the capacity of the long haul trucking industry. And as a result, you're seeing the rates, for instance, coming out of Southern California skyrocketing because folks are behind the eight ball in terms of trying to get freight from the coast into their distribution centers inland in an expedited fashion. The intermodal industry is not really very capable right now of performing that function. So I think you're seeing quite a bit of a diversion in the near term from intermodal to truck. We look at the domestic container situation, not a whole lot of a different story. Definitely lower equipment velocity is chewing up a lot of capacity. And that velocity is both on the rail, in the terminals, and at the shipper's dock. shippers are hanging on to the equipment, the containers and the chassis longer than normal. And so what that is doing is really effectively removing capacity from a system. There's been a lot of domestic containers purchased by the private container operators, not by the railroads, but by the private owners. Unfortunately, because of the supply chain issues of trying to get these containers across from China, we haven't seen the full benefit of that. We've only seen these containers kind of trickling in. And so a lot of them are probably realistically going to miss full peak season, but we should start to see the benefit in earnest once those containers arrive in quantity, which will probably spill over well into next year. One other thing that I'll point out is that, there is a pretty significant difference once again between the rail-owned fleet and the private domestic container fleet. The year-over-year drop on the rail side is much more severe. Some of that is probably to do with the heavy automotive component in the rail-owned market, rail-owned domestic container fleets. And of course, assembly of automobiles right now is being hurt badly by the chip shortage. So we are seeing a reduction in that activity. But that's probably not the whole story. That's some of the story. If you look at on the right-hand side here, we're tracking the percentage of domestic container revenue moves that are occurring in privately owned equipment, which has been averaging somewhere between 71 and 72%, but really skyrocketed here. I see that the scale here is not right, but that chart wasn't updated, I guess. I would tell you that number has been above average here for the last 3 months. There is some good news. One of the places of good news is that it looks like line haul intermodal operations of the railroads are starting to get straightened out. And there are 3 measures that they report to the Surface Transportation Board that we track on a weekly basis. One is the average intermodal train speed, which you can see here on this line in red on this chart, which has now moved up more or less to the 5-year moving average. This is all of the U.S. roads, a composite number, looking at all of the railroads put together. And so we're getting right up into sort of the overall long-term average for this measure, just a hair lower than the 5-year average, although still quite a bit lower than where we were last year at this time. And if we look at the individual class ones, I think all of the railroads are showing a much better performance, with the sole exception of NS, which continues to have some struggles in this arena. The other 2 measures that we can look at are the number of loaded intermodal cars that haven't moved for 48 hours or longer, which is the left-hand chart here, and the number of intermodal trains that are being held, which for either lack of crews, lack of power, or some other reason, congestion or some other reason. And you can see that both of these numbers have improved dramatically. The intermodal trains held has plunged quite dramatically down, almost to normal levels, which are again shown by the blue line here on this right-hand chart. Loaded intermodal cars not moving, not quite as good, but still I think the story here is generally a good one. Now, of course, this doesn't say anything about what's happening in the terminals. So these are very, very limited sort of candle in a dark room measures. But in general, I think it's safe to say that they're pointing towards more fluidity, at least in terms of the train movements over the network, than we have seen here earlier in the year. Here's one, drayage. And the drayage demand index is a measure that we put together with our friend Jason Pilsenbeck of drayage.com. And this is, to our knowledge, the only measure that tries to quantify what the pressure is in the drayage sector. And we actually look at all 21 major intermodal markets. This is the composite number. And what I can tell you is in the last 2 weeks, since this chart was put together, that number has now jumped back up. It's up at 592. And that number is so high, I don't even know what to call it. It's stupidly high, I guess you could say, or insanely high, because in the normal, up until, let's say, 2021, normally anything over 200 is regarded as extremely tight. And now we're just off the scale with some of these numbers. And in particular, the problem areas right now, we're starting to see some improvement, I think, on the East Coast, which is perhaps the first harbinger that the surge is maybe beginning to ebb a little bit, because the demand for drayage and port cartage services is a very sensitive barometer, not only of demand, but what is the supply there. And so we've seen perhaps a little bit of an influx of supply of folks that are tempted by these very, very high rates that are in there right now, but also perhaps just a bit of an ebbing of demand on the East Coast. But if you look at, for instance, LA Long Beach, that's just at a completely insane level. And I'm looking for it now. It's 1,182. So now I wouldn't say that that's twice as bad as 500, because you get to the point where it's just an indication of dysfunctionality. Folks are clicking. We're counting the number of clicks of people looking for drayage services, and they're clicking like crazy because they can't find what they want no matter what. So it's just, you get to the point here. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of difference between a level of 500 or 700 or 1,000. It's just an indication of overall dysfunctionality and kind of a meltdown in the dray. And I'll be watching this number quite closely, because if we start to see some real improvement here, that's an indication that the situation is starting to unlock and stuff is starting to move a little bit better. Now here, you put this all together, and this is kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of what is the intermodal share of long-haul trucking transportation in the United States. And the way that we look at that, this is with the help of our friend Noel Perry of Transport Futures, is we bump up the total truckload moves of reefers and dry vans moving over 500 miles, and we compare that with the intermodal numbers. And if you look, the left-hand chart here is that share that's accounted for with movements of domestic intermodal equipment, 53s and trailers. The right-hand side is what's happening with regard to IPI movements. If you wanted to look at the total intermodal share, you would add these two numbers together. And the news here, to be honest with you, is not good. And it stands to reason, because if you look at the truckload numbers for the third quarter, long-haul trucking reefer and dry van volumes are up probably about 12-13% year over year. At the same time that domestic intermodal numbers for the third quarter, I'm just looking it up here, are down 6.5%. So of course that indicates a drop in market share, and we are seeing that. The red line is the 4-quarter moving average, so that tries to take some of the volatility out of it. You saw a big jump up during the early part of the surge when intermodal played an outsized role, and trucking was slow on being able to bring drivers back. But since then, the story is kind of reversed. And normally speaking, in times of stress in the supply chain, intermodal operates as a safety valve for trucking. But this year, that situation is reversed, and trucking is operating as a safety valve for a capacity-constrained intermodal system. Now, if there's some good news in this, that is that not all of this damage is irreparable. And once things start to normalize, I expect that we'll start to see at least a return of some of this volume to the rail, because I don't think the basic intermodal competitive posture versus truck has changed all that much. What's changed here is we've got a capacity limited situation, and folks are operating tactically to get their freight moved to destination, and there's no choice but to move it on the highway and pay whatever it takes to get it moved. So I would expect once the system sort of unlocks and we start to get some velocity back and some additional capacity, we'll start to see some improvement in these numbers. But it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be just a case of answering the phone. We'll talk about that here in a minute. So just a reminder here, we should not be just assuming that the current situation is going to continue out into the future. And here's an example. I spoke before a large industry forum, wasn't an IANA forum, it was sponsored by a big intermodal player. And we had senior supply chain executives, many of them, in the room, and we conducted a survey in June of 2018, right at the height of the ELD crisis. And we asked these extremely knowledgeable individuals, what did they think was going to happen to truck capacity for the third quarter of 2018 and for 2019, 2020, and 2025. And the one that I want you to focus on is what these folks collectively thought was going to be happening in 2019. And if you look, 57% that said that volume was, or capacity, truck capacity was going to be tighter in 2018, June 2018. 39% thought it was going to be about the same, and only 4% thought that it was going to be looser. And we all know now, with the benefit of hindsight, that things were incredibly looser in 2019. So the point being that these inflections are hard to see when they're out there and we're in the midst of it. But I think, just as I did back then in 2018, I think we're standing on the cusp of an inflection point. And once things begin to turn, once we get a little bit of a break in the volume to give everybody a chance to dig out, then the system is going to improve pretty dramatically, because all of this capacity that's currently being locked up by congestion and by slow velocity is going to get released. So I think that things are going to feel a lot different next year than they are this year. If this slide looks familiar, this one or the next one, it's because it's exactly the same slide that I put 2 months ago. And there has been no change in the outlook, which is that we're not going to see a peak season. We're going to have a plateau, and recovery won't happen until volume begins to subside. Now, I'm saying Q1, it could easily be Q2. I don't think it's going to go beyond that, but of course I could be wrong. It could hang in there, but I don't think that that's the case. Even if you see volume begin to subside, the rate environment is going to continue to be very strong, because truck rates are going to be continue at a high level. Those driver wages have gone up, and they're not going to go back down. But when we look at next year, things are going to feel different, I believe. This currently endless surge will have an end. The reason it's so bad this year, we always get a little bit behind the 8 ball as an industry during peak season. There's nothing unusual about that. And then what happens is we have a slack period where everybody kind of digs out and resets. The unusual aspect of this is that we didn't get that reset period. Things went up coming out of the pandemic and have just stayed there. And so as a result, the system has just been progressively bogging down, and we're in a downward spiral. I think we're still in that spiral to a limited extent, where congestion begets slower velocity, begets lower capacity, and increasing queues, currently expressed in the form of ships waiting to be unloaded. But once we get that break, that situation is going to reverse. And so we'll start to see network fluidity return, which will release a lot of additional capacity. And that capacity will then, be available to work down the backlog further, and thus that what is currently a negative spiral will become a positive spiral. At the same time, we think that trucking capacity, Noel and I think trucking capacity utilization is going to loosen up, partially because intermodal is going to get its act together and start pulling its weight to the full extent again, and partially because a lot of this current surge is being driven by high consumer consumption and upstreaming of volume because of delays. So we're getting volume piling in now that ordinarily would be moving later. Eventually, all that's going to correct. And so trucking capacity, while it won't be abundant, will begin to loosen up, and things are starting to feel more normal. And even something that's halfway normal is going to feel really, really different than today. From a longer term situation, we're going to see more abundant trucking capacity, but the rates are not going to significantly fall, because once you take your driver compensation up, which is critical, you're not taking that back. So those rates, I think, are going to stabilize, but they're going to stabilize at a relatively high level, perhaps see a little bit. Certainly you'll see, I think, some erosion on the spot rates, but intermodal is much more about what's happening on the contract rate side of the trucking industry. And that, I think, is going to be relatively stable at a high level, but you're not going to see the kind of increases once these work their way through the system, and you won't see those kind of increases next year. From a reputational standpoint, intermodal has definitely taken a big hit this year. But I think a lot of that damage is repairable, and that lower share represents an opportunity to grow once we get back to business as usual. But having used that term business as usual, then I think one of the things that the industry needs to do is to take a look and to say, if the industry just says, wow, glad this is over, now we can get back to doing business just as we were doing before, I think that will be a major failure, because there are certainly lessons that need to be learned from a failure of this magnitude and things that need to be done differently. And what that is a topic for great discussion, and certainly nothing that can be handled in the form of a short webinar. And there are probably a lot of different opinions out there, but we need to have, I think, a major reexamination of the structure of this business to try and build more resilience into the system so that we don't have another repeat the next time a black swan event occurs, because those seem to occur very frequently these days. And even broader than just the intermodal sector, major supply chain givens, I put that term in quotes, are no longer going to be givens. And I include in that things like just-in-time inventory and offshoring, because what this situation has exposed are some of the problems that those universally, widely accepted concepts entail. And if you look at just-in-time inventory and compare the savings of that versus the cost of a stockout, which is what we're seeing right now, those costs dwarf the potential savings of just-in-time. So, for instance, I think you might see a little bit of just-in-time morphing into just-in-case. Certainly, I think changes in the inventory practices, changes potentially in where stuff is being procured from. Certainly, I think we're going to see a continued disengagement from China. You're going to see nearshoring. You're going to see even potentially a little bit of onshoring. Now, this is not going to happen overnight. These are sort of geological changes that happen over years, but they are going to happen. And when we reconvene, let's say 5 years from now, I think things are going to look pretty different. And the way this is going to get expressed in the near term is that I don't really expect to see growth rates on import TEUs. They're going to be typically exceeding the growth rate in the domestic GDP, at least the goods portion of that GDP. I think that's it. Here's my pitch for subscriptions. Go to Intermodal In Depth. We can get you going for 6 months for as little as $200 for a individual subscription. If you want a lot of granular detail on intermodal flows, go to the Intermodal Volume Analyzer, which is available on the IANA website, intermodal.org, in their data products section. And with that, Hal, I'll turn the mic back over to you, and we do still have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
And appreciate, as always, the opportunity to present here.
Thanks, Larry. Very timely, interesting news for the holiday Halloween season. Lots of challenges, but a lot of stuff to sink our teeth into. And I think we've got some good questions that your analysis has sparked. One of the first ones is around empty lift vessel data. And someone's asking, do you have any empty lift vessel data supporting the comment that the lines are not moving empties out? Seems counterintuitive, as the westbound voyage return to Asia without empty boxes leaves the lines without boxes for the next revenue move eastbound.
Yeah, no, I guess I wasn't clear. They're moving empties out. The vessels are going out, in fact, probably with a higher proportion of empties than normal. But you've got sort of a timing issue here, where typically what happens is a vessel comes in, it unloads, the empties and export loads are put on the vessel, it goes on its way through the rotation. Now you've got this surge of empties coming back in that's exceeding the inbound move of the inbound loaded TEUs coming in. So despite the fact that the ocean carriers are moving empties out, they're just not moving enough out. And so where do these empties go? And the problem is that if you're a drayage carrier that's trying to deliver empties, and all of the appointments at the designated terminal to receive the box are taken, which they are, what do you do? that empty is sitting there on a chassis, which is desperately required to move the inbounds loaded TEUs out. So you've got this kind of really, well, to use a technical term, screwed up situation. And you know, it's very tough to cut through that knot and get to a much a more free flowing situation in the near term.
Yeah, I think there was a piece in American Shipper today about some of the lines are actually moving their boxes from the East Coast to and the Gulf to the West Coast to make the westbound voyage, which seems.
Well, if that's really true, then I think that's a very counterproductive move on their part.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. I'm looking forward to getting some corroboration on that to see if that is in fact kind of a larger scale issue, because it certainly doesn't seem to make a whole heck of a lot of sense.
It would. What I will be looking for is we'll be able to see it in the ETSO data, because the East, we saw a little teaser of that as I talked about in September. If in October we see a huge mismatch of inbound containers to the West Coast, meaning loads coming in being much lower than the westbound loads arriving into the West Coast from inland, then that says that maybe that's what's happening.
Here's a question specifically about Florida ports, but I think it could probably be expanded to ports that aren't West Coast ports, or more to the point, San Pedro Bay located ports. Is the infrastructure and capacity there sufficient to really take the pressure off of the West Coast? And are the lines kind of interested in making that diverting significantly to the Gulf or the East Coast to make that happen?
You are seeing that. We are seeing diversion of volume from west to east. And that was one of the slides that I think I put up. You know, in terms of specifically Florida, well, Florida is kind of out just geographically out in right field in terms of its ability to serve inland locations. You know, Miami may have the capacity, but it would not normally be the first choice for somebody who's trying to get to Chicago. If you're going to hit an East Coast destination, East Coast port, to get into Chicago, you might do a Savannah, you might do a New York. The stuff's coming in potentially through the Suez Canal, so it's not adding a lot of ocean time, depending on where it's coming from. You know, if you're talking about Florida, the port may have capacity. I'm not sure the drayage community has capacity, certainly not long haul capacity. So these are more difficult than just hanging out a shingle saying room at the port in terms of the dynamics of this thing.
Yeah. And kind of moving on from there to a couple of equipment specific questions, a lot of good questions around this, but in terms of the growth that you pointed out in the domestic container fleet, those numbers seem to be increasing, and that seems to be picking up. So the private domestic container volumes seem to be going up. The question is, are the wheels sufficient, the chassis sufficient to move those increased numbers going up at a compensatory kind of volume so that they're actually able to be moved?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is, I don't know. Because, you know, there's two things. One is that the chassis are provided in many cases, not all cases, in most cases, by somebody other than the person that owns the box. Now, that's not true with the case of J.B. Hunt and Schneider, which are the two largest private fleet operators. They own their own chassis, so presumably they are acquiring enough chassis capacity to support whatever their container acquisition plans are. The situation gets a little bit more murky when you look at some of the other players who are either relying on the chassis pools or the railroads to provide their chassis. And of course, it's very difficult right now to acquire a chassis because the domestic, there's been a tremendous duty placed on imported chassis from China. And the domestic industry is still spooling up to meet the demand. And so you can't, if you wanted to buy a chassis, I don't care what you pay, what you're willing to pay right now, you can't get one. So, this is another example of sort of where the supply chain issues are landing in unexpected ways.
Mhm.
So I'd say there is definitely a chance, at least in the near term, that you might see a little bit of a mismatch between the container capacity and the chassis capacity. Although I expect that would get worked out relatively quickly once things normalize, say sometime in next year.
Here's another equipment related question, this on the box side. So folks are desperately trying to buy new boxes, recommission boxes that may have been decommissioned or mothballed, kind of a mad dash for growing the box side of the asset equation. So this supposes when things normalize, say 2022, do you see there being some kind of pricing battle or some kind of interesting capacity versus pricing thing opening up on the box side, since we've ramped up the capacity to try to meet this madness that we're currently experiencing?
Well, I mean, I think that the biggest contributor to capacity next year is going to be improved velocity, which is free. So we don't even have to acquire a new box. If we just get the boxes moving, all of a sudden, magically, the fleet will become enlarged because the work that it's capable of producing will become enlarged just by virtue of the fact that each box is turning more loads per month. And there's a lot of leverage to that number. So, I would not be surprised. I know this sounds kind of crazy right now. I would not be surprised if there are equipment surpluses when we reconvene a year from now. It really depends on how much growth there is, how much recovery there is in the intermodal arena on share, whether we can really get our operations back in order. Because if we do, then there's going to be a lot of capacity released here.
Yeah, and hopefully it won't be turned into container houses. Well, I think maybe we'll try to cheat one more in. We're at the top of the hour, but we'll cheat this one in. Any thoughts on the looming West Coast labor contract and how that might factor into us moving through this particularly challenging time we're in?
Well, the last thing we need is another disruption. And I think that a disruption on the West Coast, a labor disruption, would be extremely counterproductive for everybody that's involved in the West Coast ports, labor, management, carriers, you name it, because it's just going to reinforce a scenario that's already underway, which is the west to east migration. Declining share that has been arrested here, that long-term trend during the surge when everybody was trying to pile through the fastest routes. But that is already starting to reassert, and I maintain will continue to. And if you have a big disruption on the West Coast, permanent damage is going to be done to their share. I'm sure I'm not saying anything that the folks there don't already know. Obviously, if you get a big disruptive element being stirred into the pot here, just when we're trying to get back on our feet, it ain't going to help.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we are all in this together, and it's really been emphasized day in and day out over the last year plus, for sure. Well, Larry, thank you very much for the work in crunching the numbers, analyzing this, and presenting it to us in such a thoughtful way. I will remind everybody that a lot of the information that Larry called upon came directly out of the ETSO database that is available from IANA, as well as the volume analyzer that Larry put together with us. If you'd like more information about that, please head over to intermodal.org and go to the data and statistics tab. Or you can just email us at info@intermodal.org, and we'll be happy to share some information with you about that. I'd also like to once again thank our Platinum Plus sponsors, our year-long sponsors. They do help us out throughout the year and bring us a lot of great information and content, but in particular, this session of Intermodal Analyze with Larry. Many thanks to our guests who joined us today. If you like more information, please head over to intermodal.org. Brought to you by the good folks at IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight. Thanks so much.